Hello, and welcome to the annual WriteHive conference. This year is packed with a ton of great sessions for writers, writing professionals, and the publishing industry. WriteHive is a nonprofit serving the writing community with free and inclusive resources, events, programming, connections, and more. The 2026 conference brings you this session, Predicting the Future, where science fiction could explore next. Today we have Valerie Valdes. Valerie's work has been featured in Uncanny Magazine, Magic the Gathering, and numerous anthologies. Her debut novel, Chilling Effect, was shortlisted for the 2021 Arthur C. Clarke Award and was also named one of Library Journal's best SF fantasy novels of 2019. Her space fantasy novel, Where Peace is Lost, was named a 2024 Reading List Council honor title. Writing as Leah Amador, her first contemporary fantasy romance novel, Which You Would, was published by Avon Books in September 2025. And we have Robert Jeffrey II. Robert is an award-winning nominated professional writer in comic books, video games, tabletop gaming, prose fiction, and journalism, with over 20 years of experience as a creative writer. He has worked with clients such as DC Comics, Blowfish Studios, the Center for Disease Control, Son of Oak Gaming, 133 Art Publishing, Ray Comics, Subsume Media, New Agenda Publishing, MV Media, and BlackSci-Fi.com. Cristina Jurado. Cristina is a bilingual speculative fiction author, editor, translator, promoter, and creator of the YouTube podcast Librissimo. Her fiction includes her collection Alpha Land and Other Tales and her new weird eco-horror novella Chlorophilia. Welcome. And I am your moderator, Adria Bailton, a scientist by day job and a science fiction writer, along with fantasy and horror. I'm so excited to talk with our distinguished panelists about exploring science fiction settings and topics. So let's go ahead and get started with the questions that we have today. We'll jump right in with which scientific field or discovery do you wish sci-fi stories would explore more?
I can hop in.
Okay.
So for me, I like to see more sci-fi stories focused on underwater exploration. And I know people watching this will be like, well, there's this book, there's this TV show, there's this, but I want more. By trade, I'm a huge space opera fan. I've had opportunities to kind of delve into that in comics and prose fiction, or I guess short fiction. But I do think that the next unexplored region could be underwater. There's a branch of science that focuses on that specifically. The other thing that stands out to me is that the water is scary. It is like very deep, dark, and scary, just like space. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities to tell some awesome stories there, to focus on, the real world science aspects of that. I mean, if you've grown up like me watching movies like Abyss, that's huge. And then also Sphere by Michael Crichton. And also I'm a child of the 90s, so Sequest was, especially as a Star Trek fan, Sequest was like my ish, right? I loved it. But I do think that there are many opportunities to tell stories there now. And also, why not go underwater on a distant planet, on a far off planet, again, case in point, Stargate Atlantis. So I think that that's one area that, as a writer, as a creator, and as a fan, I would love to see more sci-fi stories set in.
Yeah, no, it feels like that's the final frontier on our
Mhm.
planet, right? Like
Yeah,
space is the final frontier out there, but underwater, and so much of Earth is water, frankly,
yeah.
and we know surprisingly little about it. I totally agree. That is a great answer. Um, for me, with also the caveat saying that I think there is something out there for everyone if you know where to look, discoverability, of course, being the problem, and people will always have examples. But yeah, I would love to see more stories about advances in different means of production,
Mm.
especially stuff like agriculture and materials science. It often feels like in modern society now, we can be very divorced from how food is grown, how it gets from one place to another, how parts for different machines are made. Science fiction could then not only connect some of those dots for people that they maybe don't know about, it could then also project forward into how that might change in the future. Where will we get our helium from when it runs out? We are actually almost out of helium in our strategic reserve that they decided we weren't going to have any more whoopsie doodle. What about rare earth metals? They're rare. What will we replace non-renewables with when the time comes? How will future plastics be made? What will we use instead of that? So all of that kind of material science I find really fascinating and would love to see more stories about that kind of stuff.
Wonderful. Yeah, I was very excited because when Robert said something about water, I immediately was like, my dad read 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea to me when I was kid. And that's sort of like my first intro into sci-fi. But then also I immediately thought of Sequest as well, because just
Mhm.
like so formative. And
Mhm.
I do think the questions of production are very interesting, and I haven't seen those explored as much, I don't think. It could just be my lack of breadth in science fiction, but that those sound really interesting.
I
So
think maybe they're hard to storyfy, I think is what it is. Like
Mm.
stories about exploring underwater, those are stories, right? Because you're talking about going to a place and finding new things, discovering stuff, potentially finding monsters, whatever whatever's going on down there. But how do you storyfy, I made a cool new polymer? Yeah, it's harder.
yeah, I think those tend to get incorporated more into the like, if you think about, say, Stargate Atlantis, they always had like the tech that was being pulled in.
Yeah.
So it becomes more of the productive item of the week, but we don't get like a whole
Mhm.
thing. We don't know what happens
Mhm.
to it later. So, yeah, definitely. I was thinking, you could combine the exploration of water with the science of
Mhm.
production.
So I was thinking, does anybody thought about new sciences? Because I would love to see them come into life, really. I'm not sure if that's possible. But I feel we're a little constrained by the already established ones. So I know this is not like the Olympic Games in which, you can incorporate new sports, but I wish it was. Because, for example, quantum language about a language that exists only originally by multiple instances, like in Embassy Town by China, maybe. Or, for example, communication beyond linear causality, like in Arrival by Tetian. I personally would love that we encounter other sentient non-human to develop semantic systems, for example. To me, language and communications are fields that really fascinate me, always had fascinated me. And also recently meteorology, because I think weather is such a difficult thing to predict that I wish there wasn't like a new science that could predict it.
Those all sound fascinating. And yeah, the sort of new sciences sounds like a very ripe area for science fiction.
So bouncing off of that one, which themes would you like to be explored more in sci-fi stories?
I was thinking about this very hard because everything that I liked is being explored already, but then I thought there's something in particular that it's not really a science per se, of course, but I think it's not have not has not been explored enough to me at least. I think it would have to be things related to art. For example, Argentinian sci-fi author T.P. Mira de Echeverria explores interesting concepts like, for example, living poems, poems that are living creatures. Also, I love the way China Miéville, as you know, I really quote a lot of China Miéville because I really like him, incorporates surrealism art into his novel, The Last Days of New Paris. I think that's bold and courageous because something like art is oftentimes seen as completely separated and distanced from science. So if you incorporate art into science fiction, I think it's a little bit provocative and I like it.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, making it a little bit more STEAM than STEM,
Mhm.
right?
So I personally, I like a good dystopia where the world is maybe utopian for some or most people, but the utopia isn't evenly distributed. So not necessarily the ones who walk away from Omelas level kind of disparity there. But just what are the realistic consequences of trying to achieve a utopia in a world that maybe is not yet post-scarcity? Um, I would like to see more post-scarcity stories where we have already sort of solved all of these problems that we have today, where people explore more like what is it to be human? What do we choose to do with our time when we have more of a choice because we don't have to stress out about just basic survival stuff. What drives us? What enriches us? What will we do with our one wild and precious life, as the poet saith? If science has solved a lot of our problems, I think that thinking forward like that, thinking to futures where problems are solved, can be a really important sort of trajectory map for us, as opposed to just lingering in all of the bad feels or only thinking forward to harsh futures, problematic futures, ones in which everything is destroyed Mad Max style and we're just trying to survive.
Right. You'd like to see, because science does work towards solving these problems that we do have. This is not, sometimes it feels a little bleak,
Mhm.
um, living in the current world, but as a scientist, I know that's what science is trying to do. And so
Yeah,
yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea for science fiction writers
yeah.
to, instead of yeah, looking at none of this can be solved, figure
Mhm.
out, kind of expand upon avenues of things that they're trying to solve.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be like a fairy tale, right? It doesn't have to be, oh, we're just gonna, we ruined Earth, so we're just gonna go colonize somewhere else when
Right, like
logistically that's like kind of nonsensy. But what are problems that we have and how can we actually like realistically think about solving them and make things better for everyone?
yeah. And it's still science fiction, right? So even
Yeah.
if that solution is something that is not truly going to pan out, in real life, that's not what sort of matters. This makes me think of like Reckoning, like
Mhm.
stories like that, right?
Yep. Yep.
I think for me, it's kind of in the same ballpark. I want more hope. I want more inclusion. Um, I sometimes feel that, and especially now because of the world in which we live, we get inundated with a lot of dark futures. And it'd be nice to have a little bit of hope in there, not to the point of putting your head in the sand and just completely disregarding the issues that we're dealing with. But I think one of the reasons I enjoy something like Star Trek, and it's funny because my favorite Trek series is Deep Space Nine, which is one of the darkest of the series. There's hope sprinkled in there. There's this idea that we have continue to grow as a race where we can tackle the issues that have come before. But it's only because we continue to move further out and further out. Everybody doesn't think the same way that we do. But even within that, I always felt that there was a little bit of hope, around the corner. I do think that the conflicts and struggles can definitely balance out with that realism. So that's why you have something like solar punk, that genre, or I guess the branching off of punk, of sci-fi. But as far as inclusion, I said this before, I'm a child of the '90s, so I was used to going to the bookstore and not seeing a lot of books by people that look like me. But as I always tell my wife when we go to the bookstore now, it is amazing. Octavia Butler has Begat, or Samuel Delaney has Begat, and others who have come before, a generation of sci-fi, fantasy, speculative fiction writers from the Black community, but also across the board. So I think that I would want to, within the pages, I'm speaking about writers, but then also within the pages, different experiences, to show that we all exist in the future. So, maybe that's not so much of a theme, but I think that balances well with hope. So hope and inclusion, in the sci-fi that we take in.
Well, then, with those types of things you would like to see more, are there topics that you think are overdone in sci-fi stories?
So, for me, I spoke about inclusion. The straight white male savior. I'm sorry. I want more of a balance. I was making like I was talking with some gamer friends and I noticed that when I run a video game, my character is always a black woman because or most, 10, 9 times out of 10, because, and that for me is an extension of what my love is when it comes to speculative fiction. I don't see enough black women to lead, kind of leading the charge, or at least when I was growing up. So I think that tying into inclusion, I'd like to see more of a balance for people, people of all, stripes, using science to save the day. Like I said, once again, I've read science fiction, for a while now, and you accept kind of what's available and you have fun with it, but then you start noticing that it's one particular, group of folks. And so I would want to see just, more balancing for those who celebrate science to, propel these stories forward.
Yeah, you want to see more of the faces that are in science, also
Mhm.
in science fiction,
Yeah.
potentially. Yeah, I definitely agree. Whenever I'm playing a video game and I have the opportunity to play as a woman, that's what I'm gonna do. If I can make her look Latina, let's go all the way. So absolutely agree there. I think that so for me, overdone topics I agree with Robert for sure. Um, for escape pod purposes, we're seeing a lot of AI stories now, and I think that it's both overdone, but also seems to keep needing to be done because ultimately those stories aren't about artificial intelligence. They're about us. They're about people. They're about what makes us human. They're about why we are who we are, what we care about. And as society changes, we keep pondering that orb, since the original robot creation to now. But I think that when the AI stories just kind of boil down to what if the machine we made wants to kill us? Oh no, the horror. That's where I'm kind of getting tired because and this is going to be my Mass Effect moment also. It's just like asking, what if the slaves you created wonder revolt? And like, yeah, the answer to that kind of feels self-evident, instead of nuanced. And once an AI is sapient, you give it rights. That's how this works. And so either the AI isn't actually intelligent or, you know, you have to put in the work to build these sorts of genuine reasons for conflict instead of just wallpapering over bad allegories, which I think is sometimes what ends up happening instead, and it's not great. And maybe we could stop litigating what makes, who's allowed to be people. I think that
Yeah, this is something that I also thought hard about it. The first thing, maybe because I am living currently in a conflict zone where there's a war going on, I think weapons. I'm a little bit sick of it, of them, especially in stories. Right now, it seemed to me I can't read anything with weapons on it. I just can't. Also, information technology is always somehow or for some reason, it seems that in many of the science fiction stories that I've been reading, information technology is somewhere there. And lately, artificial intelligence. I'm saturated by it. It's everywhere, and it's a very interesting topic. But I'm a little sick of it. So I would love to see something different.
Well, and I think it's AI stories are also probably because they're in the zeitgeist right now so much, right? With all
Yep.
the various ways that labels being slapped on things, accurately or not. And so I think that you're right, people are really interested in these stories. Though I do know there was quite a few like in the 70s that you already tackled this. So it does seem like we've had this discussion. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I know that we're going to get into just kind of the cyclical nature of AI and how past, or not AI, science fiction, and how past science fiction has influenced present science fiction. But I do think that it speaks to, again, just the cyclical nature of society and culture and how the more things change, the more they stay the same. History repeats itself. People are people ultimately. And I think that, again, that's why, in a way, that topic is overdone right now because, like you said, it's in the zeitgeist. It's something that we're all thinking about, we're all concerned about, we're all pondering, the different sort of facets of the conversation and how the technology is extrapolating to affect lots of different things. But ultimately, thinkers have been thinking philosophically about this stuff ever since humans humaned. We've always been doing the thing.
So we're gonna change in a little bit from the general topics and themes into how do you incorporate science into your sci-fi stories?
So I am usually more of a space opera writer than a hard sci-fi writer. So for me, the science usually functions as world building, as set design, what kinds of technologies might exist in the future, how is society changed by these different advancements? Little Octavia Butler, God is change. Um, what would be frankly what would be super cool to have in a particular like fight scene? That is something that I definitely will think about and build stuff around. But I also try to rely on science fundamentals to make sure that stuff feels realistic when I'm doing these kinds of fantastical scenes. So maybe I don't explain how gravity boots are made. I don't explain the technology inherent in it, but then I try to make sure that, how you turn them on, that they're consistent in how they work, that the function of it and sort of the physicality of it makes sense in terms of our science. And the science lets you have that kind of verisimilitude for those small details so that then you can potentially hand wave the bigger details so that people do not just fall off the suspension bridge of disbelief into the river of I'm not reading this anymore.
So I think I'm just piggybacking on your answer. I try my best to see what science will best fit the story that I'm telling. Um, I'm a Trekhead. I know about the technobabble. I know that there are legions of space opera fans who love the more realistic science. But as long as, and then there are those who are like Star Wars who are just like, hey, it's kind of magic, right? So that that type of thing. But it just depends on what story I'm telling. I'm a writer of a comic book series called Soul Nebula, so we describe it as an Afrofuturist space opera. And for that, we've done our research into what science might be available in the far-flung future, but it's not as hard sciency as another series I write for a really awesome organization called Steam Superheroes, and they have a comic book series of the same name where we that is more grounded science, that is more hard science focused on the backgrounds of the individuals who work within that organization. Some of them are cyber security experts. Some of them are, I think, actual astrophysicists. Some are, studying training to be astronauts. So I have to do my homework, for that. And that, you have to do your homework for everything, but that is definitely where we want to represent, science as it actually, exists now. So, I do my best, like I said, just to, make the science fit the story, and have a little bit of fun with it, especially with space operas, like Valerie said, there's so much that you can do, and, just kind of play around with. And, but yeah, that's how I try to come at it.
Yeah, and like what Robert was saying, I think that audience is also very important, right? Like if you
Mhm.
are specifically making something where the goal is to present specific scientific advancements in an educational context, that's going to be different from I'm writing this pulpy story that's supposed to be mostly fun. I don't want to diminish pulp in any way, don't get me wrong here, but there is a difference, right, between I'm deliberately trying to teach something with this story that I'm writing, and so I want to make sure that I've got all of these details very super accurate so I don't teach the kids wrong as a joke. And then there's that versus I'm having a good time. I'm projecting this forward. It needs to just hold water. It doesn't need to be airtight, you know? And so that I think that context and audience are very important for that as well. Yeah.
I normally include science into my fiction primarily as a way of exploring anything that has to do with ecological collapse. Also, body transformation, because I really like body horror. Sorry. Also, anything to do with identity and social instability. So I like to explore that rather than highly technical, hard science fiction, you know. In my novels, such as Bayonautas and Del Naranja al Azul, which translates from orange to blue, I draw on fields like astrobiology, epidemiology, genetics, neuroscience, and also I try with them to examine anything that has to do with first contact, hybrid identities, and the fragility of human civilization. I use alien biology and pandemic scenarios before the pandemic, by the way, that it was written before the pandemic. So I use them as metaphors for to talk about migration, coexistence, fear of otherness, and emotional dislocation. Environmental science and biology plays an even a more central role in my recent novel Chlorophylla, where climate catastrophe, mutation, and force adaptation shape a post-collapse world. And I can think that beyond genetic engineering, I would like to think that I offer some mutagenesis and evolutionary biology. Across the stories collected in my short collection Alpha Land and Other Tales, I cover cybernetics, biotechnology, altered consciousness, and post-human embodiment through some would say unsettling and often surreal scenarios. I would like to call it something like somatechnics. um, this term that I thought I made up, it's really a real theoretical term, by the way, used in philosophy and body studies that examine how technology shapes embodiment and identity. So my fiction normally treats science as inseparable from ethics, emotion, and the body, using speculative ideas to ask how humanity changes under environmental pressure, technological transformation, and social breakdown.
I think of the author, I believe that it was Shauna McGuire in a like a panel. But she said that um, audience will believe one large thing, so you get on that suspension bridge, but the rest of those ropes have to hold it up, right? That you don't get to just hand wave thing after thing after thing. You'll lose your audiences, as Valerie said. So I do think that that incorporation of real science in a way that is projected forward is super important, and it's really interesting. Though, like I say, as a scientist, sometimes I watch science fiction and I just am like, I'm probably the only one in the audience who's just really losing it right now. You know. So, and I think that also speaks to Valerie's point that depends on who your audience is and what your goals are, right? So, it's wonderful, though I think the incorporation of science and science fiction, it always improves it, in my opinion.
Mhm.
But then how do you research those ideas to incorporate? Like how hard do you make that science, I guess?
To me, the important part is to be coherent. So I normally don't dive very deep. I leave things to the imagination. But when I wanted to be very, very specific, I ask people around me. I know there are specialists, experts. Like I have this friend that's an expert in quantum computing, and every time I have well, he's a mathematician, but also an expert in quantum computing and has written books about it. So anytime I have a specific question about that, I ask him to make sure that I don't write something incoherent. I have also a friend that is a doctor, and anything that's related to biology, genetics, things like that, I try to give it to her for for so she can kind of like go through it and make sure that I haven't say something completely out of nowhere and impossible. And sometimes even I have a friend who's a physicist, and when it's something related to astronomy I try to, or physics, like universes physics, I try to, if such a thing exists, I try to run ideas by her. And sometimes I don't get like a straight answer. She may say something like, this may be possible. I just need a may be possible. I don't need to hear it is possible or it's impossible. Just it may be possible. So that's good enough for me.
That's what science fiction is about, right? The things that may
Yes.
be possible.
Pushing. Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
So do you write
give her
far
some.
future type of science fiction? I know this wasn't on the list. I was just curious.
No worries. Yeah, so the Chilling Effect series that I wrote is not far future. I would, it's probably about 300 years in the future, roughly. So it is close enough that we still have a lot of, Earth connections, one would say. The history is still there, but there's definitely a lot of change has occurred. Humans have spread throughout the galaxy. Everything is sort of a vast differential in that sense. And so I feel like once you get a couple of hundred years out of wherever we are now, the predictions that you make, someone once described the idea of predicting the future as you're like looking through a funnel, right? And so the closer that you are to today, the more narrow the funnel is. You're going to have a more limited range of options of what's going to happen. But the farther away you get, the wider that funnel is. And so the more variety of possibility exists. And I think that we can only predict so far out, right? Like you go back to the fiction of 500 years ago, and what were they predicting about the future? What did they think was going to happen eventually? Did they even have too much of a sense of that? And in some ways, there were fantastical representations of stuff that we do have today, far speaking kind of things where it's like, oh, you can talk to someone through this stone or whatever. Well, we have cell phones now. It's same concept, but just different execution. And so I feel like, in a sense, that is where science fiction happens, right? Is that you've got the near future stuff is that narrow end of the funnel. You can more clearly extrapolate. But even then, if you look at stuff from like the 1970s, extrapolating to today, you got some things that is like, video calls, but then you've got other things, flying cars, we still don't have them. Will we?
Yeah.
Keeping on that, topic of science and stories, what are some underrated sci-fi stories that use science in a unique way?
I spent too much time on this question, so I was able to kind of winnow it down to a few. But I some of the few that I came up with were the 4400, Stargate Atlantis, Sense 8, and Humans. 4400. One example that I use is the basic premise of the show is a group of people, 4400 individuals, are abducted over decades, actually going back to I think the 1930s, and they're brought back to a beach in Seattle and just brought back in like a flash, an orb or a flash of light. And what happens is, without getting too much into spoilers, each person is brought back with a set of abilities. So one of the things that I love, I describe the show as like X-Files meets Heroes. And one of the things I loved about the series was that each week you were able to spend some time with these individuals who were, he, she, they, them, lost in time or lost in time. But then, trying to get adjusted to being back, but they also have these abilities. And some of the abilities were sometimes basic, like telekinesis, telepathy, or I don't know, just a bunch of things. But there was there were a couple that really stood out. One was there was an individual who came back, and the saliva that it was discovered that the saliva that he produced was able to break down materials. And the idea was, so in our capitalistic world, corporations really started coming at them because they wanted to use, I guess, use that ability to create a weight loss drug. Now, because it's science fiction, there are side effects, but one of the things that was discussed in the episode, if I remember correctly, is that what if we were able to produce a material or some type of solution that could help with um, breaking down like waste, nuclear waste, the waste that's, so I really enjoyed how the ramifications of some of these abilities, at least from a somewhat scientific, side of things, were the science helped to tell that story in a way that I think might be a little bit plausible, but like I said, it's sci-fi. But yeah, the 4400 I think is a really good example of that.
So this is where I did a little research. I know these authors because they write in Spanish mainly, which is my native language, and I'm very familiar with the work. But I wanted to convey my thoughts about each of them. So they are Elia Barceló, Rosa Montero, Luis Carlos Barragán, and Cariana Reuben. All approach science fiction from different sensibilities. Also, they are from different countries. Most of them are Spanish, but there are some that are from Latin America. What connects them is that science in their work is rarely just a technological spectacle. Instead, it becomes a way of interrogating identity, memory, bodies, desire, marginalization, and emotional instability. Elia Barceló, she's Spanish and a Spanish author, often uses science fiction to destabilize social norms through anthropology, xenobiology, and cultural estrangement. In Consecuencias Naturales, for instance, it's a novel she wrote, alien biology and reproduction becomes tools for questioning gender roles, masculinity, and human assumptions about sexuality and power. What makes her distinctive is that her speculative science rarely feels cold or mechanical. It deeply ties to psychology, intimacy, and cultural misunderstanding. In the case of Rosa Montero, she's also Spanish, especially in her series of Bruna Haskin, which starts with, I think it's been translated into English, is Tears in the Rain. It's a science fiction novel that becomes a vehicle for exploring mortality, artificial memory, and emotional authenticity. In this book, there are replicants, but they are not simply android figures in the tradition of Blade Runner. They are existential beings haunted by programmed lifespans and unstable memories. She uses neuroscience, artificial consciousness, and biotechnology less to speculate about machines than to ask profound human questions. Like, what does it mean to remember, to fear death, or to construct an identity from fragmented experiences? Colombian author Luis Carlos Barragán approaches speculative fiction from a much darker and more corporal, like body perspective. His stories frequently merge body horror, queer desire, mutation, religion, and violence into unsettling, speculative environments. Science in his fiction often appears through altered bodies, contamination, disease, or transformation, and he blurs the boundaries between biology and monstrosity. Rather than presenting science as rational mastery, he tends to portray it as something visceral and destabilizing, deeply entangled with Latin American social anxieties. And then Cariana Reuben, she's a young Spanish author, works in a more atmospheric and philosophical register, often combining speculative technologies with questions of embodiment, perception, and emotional alienation. Her fiction tends to resist rigid gender categories, using science fictional premises to create uncanny emotional landscapes rather than just plot-driven futures. Technology in her stories often functions as an extension of psychological states like memory systems, altered realities, or transformed environments. In the hands of Elia, Rosa, Luis Carlos, and Cariana, science fiction becomes less about the future and more about fractures already present in our lives.
Yeah, I think sometimes when it's like you have again one thing that is like the weird thing that you make it weird, but then treat it as that's how that works. And then what else? What comes out of that? What are the ramifications? Like that is where stuff can be very cool. I agree. So I am going to specifically call out a bunch of escape pod stories for the most part, since I am most familiar with those as co-editor. A Shoreline of Oil and Infinity by Hanan Bernardo has a great use of like little turtle-shaped robots to help clean oils and monitor ocean conditions and stuff. Really love that one. Hey George by Elizabeth Gilt has a memory sharing technology that is used to essentially provide rich people with a personal assistant service that just wherever you go, they have George, but it's different human bodies because it's the same memories transplanted in different people. Um, then they don't have to take an actual personal assistant with them anywhere. Um, Chug the Tea Leaf, Chuck the Ads by Tim Choga has advanced algorithms offering increasingly alarming, like personalized ads that seem to suggest the character is going to be dying imminently. But I think that a story like that about like predictive algorithms is really, really cool, really interesting. We have Once Abandoned by A.P. Hawkins, which is about the science of pigeon care and breeding. Pigeons are a really fascinating subject. We definitely like mucked them up and made them how they are, and now we have them everywhere. And then also I will shout out a little more historically, Pat Cadigan's book Mind Players, which is part of a series. Super cool cyberpunk stuff that is still very, I think, resonant today. Method acting type things, very neat. Starfish by Peter Watts. What if we genetically modified people to live at subduction zones for power plant maintenance? Creepy, kind of weird, mermaidy type stuff. Sean McGuire, who you already mentioned, also has some creepy mermaid type stuff. And I will always talk about Terry Bisson's They're Made Out of Meat. I just think everyone needs to read that one. It's so short, but also, and it's like, is that one underrated? I don't know. I think maybe it's rated, it should be rated more than it is, but
Yeah.
sometimes it's like, no, everybody does that story. And sometimes it's like, oh, I've never heard of that one, so I'm never quite sure. I think it should be
Yeah.
more rated though. It's a good one.
I agree. Yeah, in at least when I was growing up, I don't actually know currently, like we read a lot of short fiction, through for English classes, right? That
Yeah.
was, I think, the easy
Yep,
way
yep.
to get kids to read, because getting a whole novel
Oh yeah.
takes a long time and whatnot. And um uh there are ones that, everyone, I feel like everyone reads, like Flowers for Algernon, right? Which I'm not sure how
Yeah.
science fiction-y that
Yes.
is, but it's kind of. Um, so
Yeah.
definitely not
It's about an
underrated.
experiment gone wrong. I feel like it qualifies. Yeah.
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 And then
Yeah. Or but then you think of like Kurt Vonnegut, like Harrison Bergeron, right? Like I remember reading that in school alongside Flowers for Algernon as kind of like a counterpoint, on the one hand you're trying to um fix in quotation marks someone's intellectual disability, and on the other hand you are trying to unfix someone's physical and intellectual, again in quotation marks, superiority. And I like our teacher intentionally juxtaposed those stories.
Oh, that's interesting. I still
Yeah.
didn't read They're Made Out of Meat though until I was an adult.
Yeah. It's so good though.
So I'll count that one as underrated, just because I was one
There
of
you
those
go.
people who hadn't read it until much later. And it is, I think, very easy to find. It's been reprinted so many places. So
Oh yeah.
yeah. Having discussed some underrated science or underrated stories that use science interestingly,
Mhm.
what do people often get wrong in sci-fi stories?
To me, this is a very personal question. I'm just going to answer from my personal point of view. I cannot answer for everybody else, but to me, the important part in science fiction, it's not really the science. The most important part is the people,
Mm.
because I think science fiction is about us. We are constantly questioning our interactions with the advances in technology, in science, in human interaction, in history even, and our reaction towards that. So I think what it matters are precisely that, our reactions, our emotions, our feelings towards that. So to me, science fiction, it's funny because some people think it's cold and they're distance themselves from the text and they think it's about machines and spacecraft and that's wonderful. There are a lot of wonderful stories that include that, but to me the most interesting part is how the characters, the people, even if they are artificial, even if they are, part mechanic or part machine, or the whole character is just machine, or or artificial intelligence, how they react. That's what I say. It's more about the people, whatever you call people or whatever you include in the term people, than the science.
There is an often repeated quote about how sci-fi writers need to be able to predict not the car, but the traffic jam. And I think that is part of where stories go wrong. And this also goes back to what Robert was talking about earlier, but like you have the one thing and then you figure out what are the ramifications of it. And so I do think that in some stories there is just too tight a focus on inventing an interesting thing, and then it doesn't have enough consideration for the broader consequences of it. You know, how does it change society? Who gets to have it and who doesn't? It's like one guy's saliva, like you're it's a limited resource. And what other side effects does it cause? You know, how does it impact marginalized people or people in different locations around the world? And so while keeping a narrow focus on what that thing is can be good, especially in a short story where you don't have a lot of words that you can spend exploring everything in the whole world, universe, whatever. I do think it is important to show that you've at least kind of figured out what the iceberg looks like underneath the tip that you're showing us, because that then says that you've actually given this thought. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's important.
Um, uh, I feel that some sci-fi can be too grandiose, and and it's funny because I sometimes when I'm at a table vending for like comic book shows or whatever, this is not just isolated to sci-fi. I feel that stories like fantasies, any speculative fiction, any superhero stories, if I get a person who comes up to the table and it's like, I'm very excited about my idea, here's the story, and they lay out like 5 years worth of like what's happened in this like this grand universe that they've built. But my question always is what's the story about the people? What's happening with the characters? So I think specifically that sci-fi stories can get too big. Definitely space operas. Like I love space operas, right? But what fascinates me about say space operas are the people that are involved in building these stories and growing these stories. And I do think that um, you sometimes, and I think this is with world building, period, don't get lost in the weeds. So in this case, it's like the science weeds, if that's a thing. So, I don't know, trademark, patent it, whatever. But um, don't lose sight of the characters and the people that are involved. They can be scientists, they can be the janitors, they can be the teachers, the educators. Like how is what's happening on this grand scale affecting them? And I think that's something that there are some stories that get it wrong and there are some stories that get it right. I think always the best example of that is something like The Expanse. We go from Mars, we go to space stations, we go to Earth, but what keeps us coming back are the people that are involved in these like interpersonal conflicts or the larger conflicts that are being built because of the science of the day. So, but that's sometimes I think it just gets too big, and just misses out on I hate to say this, I sound like a politician, the little people, they are the folks. So, but that, I sometimes I think that gets wrong.
I think I'm also going to note that something that you said earlier about like the savior narrative. I think
Yeah.
that, and I'm not even sure if this quite qualifies as getting it wrong, but I think a lot of times people will position discoveries or things like that as a solo action,
Hmm.
as one
Yeah.
single person
Hmm.
discovered a thing, invented a thing, whatever, when a lot of times it's a team effort. And I think that
Yes.
maybe that's something that often is underrepresented in sci-fi stories, that it's positioned as some person invented a thing as opposed to this entire team of people have been toiling relentlessly for a
Hmm.
long time too. Like I feel like it often seems like a bolt of lightning out of the blue, which happens,
Yeah.
but perhaps is overrepresented in stories as opposed to like, let's show the whole team is doing this stuff. Like you said, all the little people, there's a lot of people working on these things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reading the science that came before too, right? So
Mhm.
that's yeah, that's very integral. Robert especially has been mentioning a lot of sci-fi stories of the past. So how did sci-fi stories of the past impact the way we view the world in storytelling nowadays?
I think I can speak from experience when I read Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. I love the idea of course, the robots, and that's great. But to me, what was very enlightening was the psychohistory. It made me think that the concept of science was broader than I thought it was, and that we should pay more attention to social sciences. It's normally the hard science, but the social sciences are sciences too. So in my novel, for example, Bionautas, sociology plays an important part of the plot because the humans from out of space that are in this novel behave in a very different way than Earthlings. So I it was my way to honor this, Isaac Asimov, using something like sociology in my case. Not it wasn't psychology, but it was sociology, and it was my way to honor him and the good times he made me pass as a young, reader.
They stand in as allegories of where we are, where we should be going. I think that's come up a few times in this discussion and in many sci-fi panels. My mom, my dad always they told me they grew up with Twilight Zone, right? For me, it would be Star Trek. It would be Space Above and Beyond. It would be the less campy episodes of Sliders, the X-Men, which is a bit of science fiction kind of mixed in, tossing in the comic book side of things, and they're in the works of Octavia Butler, so there are so many examples of this. One of the I think because of the fantastical nature of science fiction or just speculative fiction, it's easy to use that as a platform to educate. It's I don't know if that's necessarily edutainment, but it's just a way of delivering tales of these allegory tales, so that people feel that they're being entertained, but they're also learning at the same time, and they don't feel that they're being browbeat with it. I think that there are examples of sci-fi that does that well, and there's examples of sci-fi that doesn't do it so well. So, but I love that. I don't know, like I think science fiction does that better with the message, with the messages and rather than any other genres. I think other genres can do that. Maybe you do have a crime thriller. There are crime thrillers that can do that. There are dramas that can do that. But I don't know, sci-fi just, tends to be a little bit more effective at it, I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I think that all sci-fi stories are in some form or fashion a product of their time. So no matter how predictive they try to be, no matter how successful they are predicting Octavia Butler, why did you know everything that was happening to us now?
Yeah.
But yeah, some of the stories they inspire us to actually create some of the specific technologies that they invent predicts for the purpose of the fiction. Some are warnings. Octavia Butler.
Mhm.
Not to do things, and then we end up doing it anyway. We
Yeah.
make the mistakes that we're told are going to be mistakes, and here we are. Some established tropes that we still use, rules for robots, first contact protocols, cloning pods being full of goop instead of, I don't know, nothing. Uh, but so stories today, then, they're not only part of the zeitgeist conversation, whatever it is that's in the water right now, the AI, what have you, but
Mhm.
also just kind of that long conversation that sci-fi has had with itself over time. Sometimes our modern stories are in direct reference to stuff, like they're riffing on Omelas, they're riffing on the cold equations, but sometimes it's just having the same story shapes happening over and over again, because we're human and we keep repeating history. Whoops, here we are.
I had mentioned this in a different conversation, but w- uh like my grandmother's favorite movie was Lawrence of Arabia. And so I got to see that like the 25th 5-year anniversary, but my partner had not seen it. So we watched it for whatever reason. And at the end, he goes, "This is just Dune." And we looked up, and Dune came out like 18 months, 2 years later. So, there was obviously something in the air about that particular story. And then it's interesting because we talk about the effect of past stories having on, the original Dune was written in like 1965, I think.
Mhm.
Um, and or 63. I can't remember which one was which it was. But anyways, but then we have people who just keep going back to that story and retelling it and reshowing it, even if they are basically doing the same book. We have the movies that are called Dune, but there's other stories too that are very similar. So definitely something that keeps coming back up in the water, I guess.
Kind of tying into what Valerie was saying as far as even the predictive nature. Um, do Octavia Butler in the 2020s, just kind of where we are.
Mhm.
But, looking specifically, I give the example of Trek. There's, I think it's either the first or second season where, um, at that point, well, Captain, Cisco and Dr. Bashir, they travel back in time, to the, they travel back to San Francisco, and there's an event called the Bell Riots that is very big in the history of the birth of the Federation and Starfleet and whatnot. And somehow or another, Cisco gets involved in the history, and I'm not going to get too deep into it. But one of the things that they come across is the tent cities, for the unhoused. So basically, people who are on the lower end of the economic strata, basically working poor, and to middle class, or people who are jobless, are pushed into these areas called sanctuary cities. And when they walk through the sanctuary cities, it I think the model that has been used for is, I think this is the name of the area, Skid Row in Los Angeles. And it's just basically, so it shows that, it's basically showing kind of where we are in present day, but this was an episode that came out in 93 or 94. So it's that thing that every time the Bell Riots, pops up in like my feed or my Star Trek feed, it's like we are we are any further along, than we need to be. So I think that it's definitely predictive of the issues of the time. And this episode came out in like the early 90s. So that's kind of where the allegory, side of things comes in.
Yeah, and I think even Dune, going back to that, the idea of the thinking machines, and us declaring essentially a jihad against them because of the fact that they are a big giant problem. And religiously speaking, we just go, no, not going to do that. And then instead, what we end up with is people being treated as objects and turned into thinking machines, which is a different kind of problematic. And it's like, oh, yeah, we just substituted one horrifying problem for a different one. Well done, humans. We keep doing this. And colonization. Guess what we did again in Dune? This is the far, far, far future, and yet we still keep making this same mistake again. And so I think that part of then of sci-fi is trying to decide which are the mistakes that we keep repeating, which are the mistakes that feel most intrinsically human, I guess, and therefore most prone to having a pendulum swing in one direction and then having the pendulum swing right back. I like to see more of the hopeful stories like we've talked about, where maybe we just get rid of the pendulum. Maybe we don't do that anymore. That would be nice. But I think a lot of sci-fi is instead just exploring the pendulum motion. What happens when it hits one end versus the other, one extreme or the other?
So this probably goes a little bit with an earlier question, with incorporating science into your stories. But how do you choose which current scientific advancements to project forward into the future in a particular story, and why?
So for me, first, I would say it has to be interesting to me. personally. I'm gonna write the thing, so I have to care. I have to like it. I then tend to build the world around what I need for the characters, for the plot. So I build everything simultaneously, more or less. I'll usually have one thing that's kind of my like anchor point, and then everything else I build around it so that it all makes sense together. But what that can mean is that I'll see a thing and be like, how would that make life easier or harder for someone? What problems this thing cause specifically? And I'm gonna talk about Octavia Butler again. But she talks about how the only lasting truth is change. And so to me, that's what I then will look for story purposes is technology that will change things. And then how, why, for whom, in what ways, that is what to me then kind of builds the story.
As I evolve mm, as a writer, I feel I tend to, I don't know why, to incorporate more underrepresented sciences. That's what I tend to do. I don't know why. Maybe I have a feeling for underrepresented things. I have explored non-human to human communication. I like to think it's something like exolinguistics. And also particle ecology in chlorophylla, because basically the chlorophylla starts with a sandstorm as a character, as a sentient thing. So that's why I call it particle ecology, because a sandstorm is basically a giant mass of sand, but it's formed by little grains of sand, right? So it's something like a collective being in my head. Also, I had a short story in printed in Clark's work called Embracing the Movement. And I was thinking about how would it be to encounter another species that speaks in a different way than us, using movement of their multiple body parts as a way to communicate. And because we are, each of us is one person and we don't have multiple things going around us or anything. Maybe we could use drones for that, but let's say you were an astronaut alone in, spacecraft, a small spacecraft, and you encounter such a creature. There's no way you can communicate because you don't even know that those strange movements of these parts, it's a language. So I try to imagine what it would be the interaction between those two beings in embracing the movement. I'm really interested about communication and linguistics, maybe because I've moved around. I've moved to so many different continents, and I had to learn new languages. And often I misunderstood or was misunderstood, or couldn't understand what was happening around me. That always fascinates me. Languages fascinate me, and the way we communicate.
It sounds really interesting. I immediately went to, of course, insects and animals like dolphin to the human,
Yes.
right? Or bees and
Yes,
when you talk about like a collective, right? Because they do like their little dance to tell their
exactly.
other bees, or at least honeybees. I don't know about like some of the more solitary bees like carpenter bumblebees, but honeybees will like do their little
Hmm.
like flight dance to tell the rest of the bees go
Yeah.
over there for the good pollen.
Have you seen Finding Nemo?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
My kids are the right age that, of course, we saw that.
Yes. There is a wonderful part in which there is a band of fishes making signs to the main character to show the direction.
Yeah,
That's what I thought about my creature. How, I mean, not pointing an arrow,
right.
but or pointing a direction. But what if we had, like being made out of smaller beings, but all thinking on a like a high kind of consciousness. So that was my inspiration for embracing the movement.
Oh, neat.
Finding Nemo.
Finding Nemo.
So for me, it's whatever's fun to write. I think that I know that's a very simplistic answer, but first, and to Valerie's point, you got to be interested in it, and I think second to that, what it builds, what story that you're trying to tell. I love the idea of the multiverse, and I love sliders. So, but I also strangely love like 24. So it was that thing of um, what technology exists, which could kind of or what could exist that could tie into like my interest in those two concepts or those properties. And then you come up with something like the crossing, so like that's might always say like my multiverse hopping action thriller, so I have to am I going to have fun writing it, and also will people be interested to read it? I think that comes third, but then also what what scientific advancements, fit the story that I'm trying to build. So,
Keeping up with stuff can be a challenge, right? Where it's like,
yeah.
oh, I made up
Mhm.
this thing, and then suddenly we have a technology that it's like, oh, that makes that just obsolete and unnecessary. So now I'm writing a multiverse story instead of a
Yeah.
sci-fi future story.
Yeah, that can happen. How do you deal with that then if you're writing a story and suddenly there's been a scientific advancement that makes it moot? Do you pretend that science advancement hasn't happened, or do you switch tactics?
I totally tossed the story away. No, I don't know. I mean, it's,
Honestly, that was kind of going to be my answer
yeah.
too. Like,
So it's
possibly
like,
I just let it go.
yeah, I mean, that's the good thing, at least, for writers, is that you have no shortage of ideas, for things to create. Um, and if you don't care too much about the advancements, you just go ahead and just do it. Even if it is obsolete, somebody will be interested. There are, I think, stories about, tech. I think about something like steampunk or
Mhm.
steam
Yeah.
funk, and that's technology of like a yesteryear.
Mhm.
But I'm still like very interested in that, but some people might say, well, that's outdated, that's old timey. And it's just like, well, you're missing out on a lot of, story, like a lot of interesting stories that you can tell. But yeah, it's crazy because a lot of Trek science, the things that we used to see on Star Trek: The Next Generation or earlier, like the flip out phones or um, the I might be going on a tangent or whatever, but like the data pads or the
Yeah.
tablets. It's those are things that maybe seem outdated to some, but they still serve a purpose, I think, in storytelling. Depending on the story that you want to tell.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And by the way, sh sideways shout out to Pimp My Airship, Marisha Broaddus. Everybody go read that one.
Yes, yes.
High five there. But like, I will bring up actually. So the Black Panther film, I felt like established a lot of technology that was potentially more advanced than technology that we have today, potentially different from or more advanced than technology within the Marvel verse at the time that it was being brought up. But it felt like I think what I loved most about it is that it felt as if they had found alternative technological solutions to a lot of technology that we have today, but they just kept doing their own thing because that's how they were doing it. And so it felt like a fully evolved society with their own forms of communication. Like I remember there was like a sand holograph thing that they had
Yes.
that popped up
Yeah,
that was
that
this
helped.
three-dimensional thing. That was so cool. And it was like, well, they're not going to just switch to like, FaceTiming or whatever because they have this other thing and they use it. And why do they care? They don't need to change. And so I think that's another approach to incorporating whatever it
Mhm.
was that you were doing along with whatever the technology is today. It's like, well, maybe you adjust your story to accommodate the thing so that it now works as a seamless whole. Maybe you just be like, whatever, my protagonist keeps using the other thing for reasons because they can. So who cares?
Sentimental value, right?
Yeah, or because it's what they know is because it's what they
Yeah,
and it works. It works fine. Why try change to something else that is just as good or different? Like why retrain yourself? It's not necessary. So,
yeah.
Well,
and
thank
it's
you.
cool. It's just real cool. Sorry.
No worries. And thank you for taking the tangent with this was kind of alluded to earlier in the Star Trek versus Star Wars uh, comment, but if sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, how do you keep your future gadgets grounded in what we know while also giving yourself the freedom to imagine inventions beyond what is possible today? Do you even worry about that, or do you just go with what works for the story?
I don't worry about it. I mean, if George Lucas didn't worry about it, I'm good. I so I it's whatever works. Like I said, I think that I am less of a hard science person. Um, and I whatever works for the story. I think that and maybe I'm a little bit of a Buck Rogers, type of style when it comes to the technology, but I do think that when it comes to, and Trek is my thing. So there's not a lot of magic, magic-y science that you get with that. But I also love, like, I just use Star Wars, Star Wars as the example. Um, I like how they handle not handling science in there, um, and it just works. I do think that even within Star Wars, there is the science that's represented, let's say, by like the Scrappy Rebellion, or their science is representative of the time in which that movie was made. So it was like made in the 70s. So they have not moved too far away from until you get to the Phantom Menace and the whatever, there's a whole discussion there. But I think even in that universe, there is a balance between some type of actual science and then like the magic-y stuff. Um, and there's just a balance that's told depending on whatever Star Wars story that's being told. So um, something like I'm thinking of there was a Jedi show that came out a couple years ago with the twins, and I can't remember the name of it, but that is very like steeped in magic and kind of discussions of faith and whatnot. And you balance that against a show like not Rogue One, but I'm
Andor
forgetting
or
Andor. Yeah, I'm forgetting like all the names of these shows. So you balance that against something like Andor, where I think the science is actually a little bit more practical and it's not magic-y or whatever. So I think that um, I don't personally worry about it. It all depends sometimes on like the story that I want to tell, as far as like the science versus magic side of things.
yeah, was it The Acolyte? Was that the one
The
or no?
acolyte, yeah, the
Is
the
that it? Oh,
acolyte.
okay. Yeah.
The acolyte, yeah.
So like I said before, yeah, for me, I try to do just kind of small detail grounding so that then I
Mhm.
can do the big picture hand waving. And so, in keeping actually also with the way I think Star Wars does it too, which I think works really well in agreement here, is that I then try to focus on like what a thing does and making that feel real, making it feel realistic. And I don't necessarily explain how a thing is put together. But just like you show it in use, you show people using it, doing things with it. And I think that POV can be a really easy way to handle this. So I'll write characters who can, drive a spaceship, fly a spaceship, but maybe they don't know how to repair it beyond just kind of the
Mhm.
basics of, oh, this thing fried and so I have to replace it or what have you. Like a lot of people can maybe change your car's oil, maybe you can take out a battery, maybe your dryer dies and you know how to pull out the thing and put it back in and then it's drying again. But can you take apart your car engine? Maybe not. Do you know how the combustion process works? Can you explain it scientifically to somebody? Maybe not. But you can describe how does it feel to drive the car. How you can talk about the speed, the tires squealing, the feel of the steering wheel in your hand, stuff like that. You can ground it in those kinds of details. And then you don't have to explain how does a car work. And I think that's sort of the intersection that I play with is that verisimilitude plus hand wavium. And I think Star Wars is really great at that. You don't necessarily know how a spaceship flies. You know that it does like a warp thing, and that makes it go zoom zoom. And you don't necessarily, there's a warp drive and it can break, and then you can't do the zoom zoom. But beyond that, how does it work? Well, later films maybe get into a slight more detail, or some of the books may do, but ultimately, like it doesn't matter. The thing broke and you can't zoom zoom. That's all you need to know.
Hmm. I tend not to worry about that because I remember once I explained to my grandma, which was an uneducated woman born in the early 20th century in the middle of nowhere in Spain, how Earth revolves around the sun. And she just plainly laughed at me. She did not live long enough to witness cell phones, much less smartphones. But I bet she would have thought that those were playing magic, because for her was something that, how can you communicate anytime, anywhere, and look for information? I mean, she would have been flabbergasted by them. So, and she lived a long life without really believing that, Earth goes around the sun. She did not believe that. And even if I tried to explain to her. So I thought, okay, maybe she lacked information and education, of course, but she was useful to society. She was a wonderful grandma, and I'm very proud of her. And I don't feel bad, or I don't feel less of from her because she was not able to get the education she deserved. But I think she did the most out of what she got, and she lived her life without knowing those things, and she was useful. So I think, okay, it's better to be informed, it's better to be educated, but you can still live and you can function. So I don't need to know all the little technical details of the gadgets are proposed or the technology are proposed. In Bionautas, I have this intelligent matter that you can actually configure it in whatever you want just by thinking about it. And you think, okay, I need a bed, and this thing comes out of, the matter comes out of the wall and makes a bed for you. So I didn't know how to explain why it works the way it works. I just made it happen. And I didn't feel that it was necessary to explain the science behind it, because it would have been disruptive to the story. I didn't think it was necessary to appreciate that world building. I understand some people may, prefer to know all the little details, but I don't think it's the majority.
So, this brings us up to our wrap up. So, as we close out the panel, what would you like Right Hive attendees and later listeners to walk away from, or walk away with from this panel?
So I would like for people to understand that when they think about science fiction, the reality is that science fiction is much less about science than about people.
Mhm.
That's what I really think. When they think about the stories, when they really dive into movies, TV series, books, comic books, or video games that you can label in science fiction, they should really think about what matters in those stories are probably, or the storytelling is probably the people, much more than whatever wonderful science or strange science or mundane science it is.
I hope you had a good time. That's always first and foremost. But I do think that I want, anybody watching and listening to this to just immerse yourself in science fiction, and just in STEAM just in general, and maybe see where there are parallels, with where we're going and where we're imagining that we're going, and try to find more inclusive authors, or creatives that are working on these TV shows and movies, because there are things within our experiences that are similar, when it comes to telling these stories, and there are things that are different that I think that you can appreciate. So, I that's kind of what I hope that you take from this discussion.
Yeah, my answer is pretty similar, which I first will say follow your interests, follow what you think is cool, because that will take you, that will sustain you
Mhm.
when the creative process becomes challenging in other ways, as it will. Write about the thing that you think is cool, and then this piggybacks more on what Robert said, but just to make sure that as you are extrapolating stuff into the future, that you are not leaving out whole groups of people from the future the future is for everyone. Bring everyone with you as you go to it.
Wonderful. And then, as our last question, where can viewers and listeners find you?
So you can find me online at I'm on Blue Sky, Valerie Valdes, on Instagram, Valerie Valdes author. I have a website, valerievaldes.com. And if you want to watch me play video games, sometimes science fiction, sometimes fantasy, I stream on Twitch most nights. The kids are asleep is the Twitch stream because that's when we stream.
The website is Robert K. Jeffrey. It's like jeffrey.com, robertkjeffrey.com. Instagram is the best place on social media to find me. It's robert.k.jeffrey. Robert.k.jeffrey. I'm on Blue Sky, but I don't remember my handle. And I'm also on Twitch under, username SYNCHRKJ, SYNCHRKJ. And normally I'm running the Division 2 with friends or Marvel, I think it's a Cosmic Alliance or Cosmic Invasion. It's just beat 'em up for a player, beat 'em up with all the heroes from the universe. So, but yeah, those are the places where you can find me.
Yes. If you wanted to find me interviewing authors from all over the world, especially from the Spanish-speaking world, but not only, I also interview people from the English circuit in English, by the way. And even when the interviews are in Spanish, you can see the subtitles in English so you can understand. I have a YouTube channel called Librissimo, which you can translate as very bookish. And I do these talks with authors. They're very short, 40 minutes maximum. And we normally talk about their new releases in Spanish, whether they are from other countries and their work has been translated into Spanish, or whether they're from a Spanish-speaking country and their books are coming out. We do this kind of mini presentation, so it's kind of a tool for them to talk about the work, the new releases. And sometimes people cannot attend their signings or their presentations, live presentations, so they can use it as a tool to inform about the work, the book. So you can find me there. And then I am a contributor of Small Planet. It's a new magazine that talks specifically about fiction in translation. The editor is Rachel Cardasco, who has this wonderful blog called Fiction in Translation, and talks about all the short stories translated from any language you can imagine into English, and also the novels. So I'm a contributor there, and I also a regular contributor for the Madrid Review. It's a literary magazine based in Madrid, Spain, but it's entirely in English. And you can find me there, and also in my website called DNAsetproject.com. So you can find me there.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful. And then hopefully you'll be able to be in the chat during the weekend. And so people attending Right Hive will be able to ask questions live. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful Right Hive and a good time. And thank you, Robert and Valerie, for chatting.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
All right.